All right, welcome back to the broadcast, Breitbart News Daily, the name of the show. Just about every week at this time, we're joined by our pal Frank Gaffney, who runs the Center for Security Policy. You can go to securefreedom.org and counterjihad.com. And he also has an important group called Present Danger China, presentdangerchina.org, Committee on the Present Danger of China, where he takes a look at really what is one of the biggest geopolitical threats to the United States in our history, and is getting some front page attention by establishment media, but relatively new. And it took the NBA kind of stepping in the crap in order for this to happen. But anyway, however we got to do it. So, Frank, we got a lot to talk about around the world per usual. Let's start with China. The one China policy, I think, is another thing that could potentially be on get more scrutiny on a global level. The one China policy is basically China thinks of the entire world as China, not just what we think of as China. And in particular, they think of Taiwan and Hong Kong as part of China, as well as some of these establishments in the South China Sea. And the Chinese defense minister, with some pretty intense language that we've been reading about how the Beijing considers the momentum of China's reunification so strong, Frank, that it cannot be stopped by any individuals or forces. Yet much of the world, including the United States, would like to think of Hong Kong and Taiwan as having some independence. So what are we to make of all this?
What we're now seeing, Alex, is the inevitable conclusion of a serious policy mistake that was made back during the Carter administration. It began, to be put into motion during the Nixon years, to be sure, but it was Jimmy Carter who said, we're no longer going to recognize Taiwan. We're going to now recognize China, mainland China, communist China, as the only China. And, one could argue that it was a mistake to pretend that mainland China didn't exist, that had to be corrected. But to now pretend, as we have for decades, at the insistence, the growing coercive demand of communist China that there's no Taiwan, that it doesn't exist. I mean, it's not a multi-million person, freedom-loving, functioning, democratic, free market capitalist nation is insane. And what has really begun to develop is that again, the insistence of the communist Chinese, is that we and the rest of the world have to increasingly accommodate what they are professing will be their rightful conquest of Taiwan as part of a one China policy, as part of their manifest destiny, as part of the China dream, whatever you want to call it, under Chinese rule. What we're seeing in Hong Kong is a tiny and relatively benign foretaste of what the Chinese Communist Party has in mind for this other nation. And by the way, Alex, as I think you know, I think the vast majority of the people of Taiwan don't think of themselves as Chinese. They think of themselves as Taiwanese, and they certainly don't want to be enslaved.
So much of the world, Frank, including us in the West, I think Little League Baseball refers to Taiwan as Chinese Taipei. I think that so many of our companies are apologize for if they use a map of China and they don't include the Chinese map, which is not recognized by the international bodies that kind of sanctify or codify maps, Frank. They don't have the same view of what China is as the Chinese Communist Party. And yet, again, another one where we just all bend to the will of the Chinese communists here, and there's just almost zero pressure publicly to stop doing it.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the NBA, of course. The National Basketball Association was kind of the poster child of this practice of kowtowing to the Chinese demands of a reality that they're going to impose on all of us, and their censorship of our language, their imposition of maps that are not again, accurate, but politically conform to their dictates is really par for the course. And the trouble with accommodating it, the trouble with doing it, whether it's at the corporate level, whether it is at the state level, whether it is at the sort of national level, is that we will inevitably be playing into the Chinese expectation that they can demand of us what, well, Recep Tayyip Erdogan demanded just recently, which is that we get out of the way as they do whatever it is they see fit to do, and including, unfortunately, I'm afraid, the kind of military invasion and occupation for which the Chinese communists have been preparing for decades. Now, there's no question, I think, in the minds of most serious, China military observers that they're very close, if they're not already there, to having the capacity to mobilize massive numbers of invaders, accompanied or preceded by immense numbers of ballistic missile delivered weapons that would essentially suppress Taiwan's ability to defend itself, and, by the way, keep us from coming to its aid or even its rescue by attacking, for example, our aircraft carriers underway at sea with ballistic missiles. These are the sorts of new realities, if you will, that are being increasingly brought to bear to enforce Chinese political demands into the West. And this is again what I think President Trump has done more than any president in our history, certainly since Nixon, to challenge is this, process of inexorable accommodation, acquiescence, capitulation to China. And he deserves great credit for it. It's just that it needs to be reinforced at this moment, because I fear they're perceiving, whether it's a skinny trade deal or whether it's a lack of, real pushback on Hong Kong, to say nothing of this most recent statement by the Chinese defense minister that they're going for it. It's just a matter of time in Taiwan, and no one will be allowed to stand in their way. These are the sorts of things that have to be challenged now, lest we find ourselves responding to some horror, a la Erdogan in Syria.
So how do you feel about the momentum? Because China's rhetoric is always very tough. So do you feel like they're on their heels here? Because this is something that I think, for a variety of reasons, we're considering more and more in sort of our mainstream coverage of the news here in the United States. And I'm sort of heartened to see so many people that at least have a basic grasp on some of the humanitarian strife that takes place within China. But are people... Do you feel like that the president's policy, Frank, has been effective in keeping the Chinese and the communists on their heels, or do you think that they're just they have a long march approach to everything, and do you believe that they are ascendant still at this moment?
I think, ironically, both of these things can be true to some extent, Alex. I think the president's approach to using trade and countermeasures to the predatory practices the Chinese have used against us for decades. Unrestricted warfare, as we've talked about many times, is the title that Chinese military officers themselves have given this practice of economic and really all kinds of other asymmetric warfare techniques that the Chinese have been bringing to bear against us, arguably since Deng Xiaoping's time. Now, he, as we've discussed, had this sort of hide and bide strategy so that you weren't able to see as clearly what they were up to. Under Xi Jinping, the mask is off, and now it's for everybody to see. But they're back on their heels in the sense that as a result of what President Trump has done, in particularly the area of trade, tariffs and sanctioning companies and keeping us from doing business with them, and increasingly articulating in our national security strategy that China is the existential threat of our time. These are all things that I think have, to some extent, very unexpectedly challenged the Chinese at a moment when Xi clearly thought he was going to be able to begin dictating terms, universally, including to us. So this is a critical moment when their power is such that they can begin throwing their weight around violently, as well as through these other economic and asymmetric warfare means, and yet they are also, I think, now increasingly challenged across the board. And this is the greatest opportunity of our lifetime, and maybe the last one we'll have, Alex. The American people and even political figures on the left and on the right have, for this moment, really begun to, sort of come around Donald Trump in recognizing China as a threat and opposing it. He should do everything he can to capitalize on that now. This is our moment.
Yeah, I agree with you, Frank, and I think that there is some momentum on our side to continue the pushback against China.
Has to.
Let me ask you about some of these Navy drills that are taking place. The U.S. conducting high-end warfighting exercises in the South China Sea. What do you think the objective is here? Do you know any of the details?
Well, I've been watching the excellent reporting on the subject by Breitbart, and some of this is just common sense, Alex. What we have confronted as a result of decisions that the Obama administration made has been the inexorable transformation of this vast ocean area known as the South China Sea into increasingly what the Chinese have long asserted it was, namely an interior lake for communist China. And that is a direct result of our having acquiesced during the Obama years, particularly, to the construction of a whole series of man-made islands, which, despite promises to the contrary made to the Obama administration, have been fortified. There are now all kinds of weapon systems there, from aircraft landing strips to missiles, anti-ship missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, port facilities for submarines and other vessels, from which the Chinese can project power and begin to dictate terms as to who will use those waters, who will transit them. A third of the world's trade crosses them each year. A lot of it is, of course, on the water. Some of what goes on there is underwater. Some of what goes on is over the water. The Chinese are now insisting, increasingly aggressively, that you need their permission to use those waters and airs and so on in whatever ways you have in mind. This is something we are challenging with increasingly, I think, important movement of our forces, demonstrating the freedom of navigation with armed combatants inside the 12-mile limit that the Chinese are claiming is their now territorial waters. And this exercise, the largest, I think, since 2001, which two large aircraft carrier carrying vessels, one an amphibious ship, one a aircraft carrier, are doing basically war games in those waters. It's an assertion of power. The challenge for us is they're there permanently. We're there part-time. And it's hard and it's expensive, and we don't have, frankly, the naval assets and aircraft to stay there as we need to protect the vital right of free passage through those waters and airspace. But it's a good step in the right direction, and I think an important signal of what we were talking about a moment ago, our determination to challenge and counter Chinese communist imperialism.
Frank, let's turn to Turkey now and Syria. And there is basically, with the United States moving some forces around, it's kind of up to other parties, other countries to work out what's going to go on there. And so who are the various sides? Because it's very hard to keep up. And so there's a bit of a power vacuum now. Erdogan wants to fill it, but a lot of people don't want Erdogan to fill it, or a lot of nations don't. What's the breakdown at the moment?
Well, it's a multifaceted, dynamic environment, Alex, with essentially 5 players. With our more or less removing ourselves as one of them, You have, of course, the Turks. You have the government of Syria, such as it is, of Bashar Assad. You have the Iranian mullahs and their own forces increasingly, as well as their proxies, Hezbollah. You have, of course, the Russians, who, once again, were essentially allowed, I think is the best word for it, to come into Syria in force during the Obama years. And then there's this entity that doesn't supposed to exist anymore, but does and will increasingly, known as the Islamic State or ISIS. Those five sort of elements are now jockeying for power, trying to divide the spoils, making to varying degrees modus vivendi that will enable them to, have their way, protect their interests, advance to some extent agendas that are inimical to our interests, and we will increasingly be unable to do anything about it. Now, we are, I think, trying to stay in the game to some extent by moving the forces that we previously had in small numbers in these areas of northern Syria across the border into Iraq. But I think everybody else, all five of those combatants or competitors, shall we say, have now pretty much discounted the influence of the United States, and they're seeing what they're going to be able to do vis-a-vis one another, either by consent or probably by violent means in the days ahead.
So let me ask you about Russia's role in this, because Erdogan is going to have a meeting with Putin, and I think a lot of people in America, it's a bad narrative for the president. Putin's able to strengthen his hand here. How do you think this plays out?
I think the way this plays out, Alex, is that Bashar Assad and his team, which includes prominently, of course, the Russians, let's face it, they have enabled him to survive in exchange for ports and airfields and the ability to test out some of their weapons and otherwise assert themselves as sort of kingmakers in this Syria, such as it is, and the Iranians. And, as I say, their terrorist sort of foreign legion, Hezbollah, are, I think, going to ensure that most of Syria will be under one or the other of their dominion, their control. If it's that team, it might have the nominal assent of Bashar Assad, but more and more likely it will simply be whatever the parties tell him will be the way it is. And this is particularly worrying about the Iranians because, as you know, what they're interested in is really projecting power throughout that region, the so-called Shiite crescent, running from Iran through Iraq, through Syria, through Lebanon to the Mediterranean. A problem for us as well as Israel and the region more generally. And then, of course, there is this problem that the Russians are going to be wheeling and dealing with the Turks. They've got a very complicated relationship with them. They compete with them in some cases. They arm them in other cases. They see this relationship with Erdogan as an opportunity to undermine NATO and weaken us further. So I think the Russians are probably going to be doing what they have proven to be very adept at doing, even under Putin, even under an economy that's pretty weak, and that is become an arbiter in this region to the benefit of Russia, China, and their cronies and allies, and at the expense of certainly Western interests in general, including notably Israel's and ours.
All right. So again, Frank Gaffney is with me, securefreedom.org, counterjihad.com for his Center for Security Policy work. He also is presentdangerchina.org for his committee on the present danger China. And I want to ask you about some breaking news that we have this morning, Frank, and your view on this. The UK police have arrested a person with 39 dead people in his truck. The truck came from the EU. It was a semi-truck trailer, We believe it's come from Bulgaria. This seems like mass migration botched. This has happened in the past. This is a huge number of people dying. We report on this from time to time in the United States, where some people will turn up dead in a truck. This is a huge number. I'm guessing, because this is breaking news, I'm sure you don't have this fresh in front of you, but assuming this is what it appears to be, which is a mass migration attempt, botched, coming from the EU. So if it came from Bulgaria, who knows where these people are from at this point. 39 of them killed in a truck, it appears, in a illegal immigration scheme. Is wild stuff. Frank, any thoughts?
I don't know anything more about it than what you just told me, Alex, but it sounds right from your description that we're watching play out in this microcosmic, tragic situation what has been going on now for years of people who are not allowed into the West, into Western Europe, nonetheless coming there by hook or by crook, and in some cases losing their lives as a result. And I fear, Alex, we're going to watch this whole horror ramping up again at the hands of Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, the same, dictator, so-called ally of the United States. I believe he's an ally no more. Nominal member of NATO, but increasingly batting for the other team, who is threatening to unleash millions more of those who have taken refuge in Turkey into Europe, as he did in 2015 and 2016. And this is a tragedy on so many different levels, but I think the fact that if your characterization is correct, it's reaching even to the United Kingdom, which of course has been one of the things that has fed, I heard a bit of your reporting on the Brexit situation, it has fed the desire of the people of the United Kingdom not to be subjected to the European Union's lunatic rules about basically letting in anybody that and letting them freely, move around the European Union. I think this is likely to intensify the pressure for the British to establish once again their own sovereign rules. And I hope they'll be able to do so by getting out from under the European Union as soon as possible.
Yeah, this is a very good connection that you're making, because Erdogan has threatened to. I think the language was that he was going to open the gates of Europe, or maybe that was Viktor Orban's language describing it. But
he has in mind breaking down the gates of Europe, to be sure.
Yeah, sure. So Erdogan wants to open up Europe via Turkey, and Viktor Orban obviously has a problem with that, because he's as hawkish on immigration as any major world leader at the moment. What do you break down what Erdogan is threatening to do, what he has the ability to do, and what can be done to block him?
Well, Erdogan has taken in millions of refugees, many of them from Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East. That, I think, is to his credit. He is now intent, one of the impetuses, as you know, Alex, behind this Syrian invasion of northern areas of the border specifically, is so he can create not only a safe zone free of the Kurds, particularly the ones he calls terrorists, but basically any of them, and sort of replace them with some of these Sunni Arab refugees in order to basically change somewhat the demographics of the country and establish a safe haven or safe zone, as he calls it, but also to get rid of a lot of these refugees. But he has more. And one of the things he has figured out and demonstrated in the past is that he can coerce Europe into making enormous concessions, financial, political, geostrategic, to him if he either threatens or simply begins pushing out some of these refugees and sending them north to Europe. Viktor Orban, of whom you've spoken, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has secured his borders against this kind of tidal wave, and done this at well, it has infuriated the European Union. They've condemned him. They've tried to coerce him into opening up his borders. He won't do it. And he's even now, I guess, been threatening that there will be violent responses if he faces this kind of assault again. We'll see about that. But the main point is he is standing up for Europe and trying to prevent this from happening again. And what typically this translates into is either some other European countries, notably the Germans, notably the Swedes, will be taking them in. There's much appetite to do that anymore. And that means probably they will try to pay off Erdogan in one currency or another, including just old-fashioned cash.
Frank Gaffney, thanks so much, Frank. Always appreciate the information and analysis.
Great to talk with you, Alex. Thank you.
All right. Talk to you next week. We'll be right back.